Picture this. A young man stands at a train station in Germany. It's 1941. He's wearing a new uniform, tight boots, and a forced smile. His mother is crying. His father shakes his hand. A younger brother watches quietly from the side. The man climbs onto the train. He's told the war in the East won't take long, that the Russians will fold, that he'll be home by Christmas. But Christmas comes. Then another year. Then silence. Letters stop. The family waits. Hopes. Prays. He never comes home. This story happened thousands of times. These men didn't die in glory. They didn't fall in famous battles. Many didn't even die in war. They disappeared in places most of us will never see. Frozen fields, dark forests, nameless prison camps. They're the forgotten faces of a brutal war. The ones who marched into the Eastern Front and never returned. If you're still watching, it's because you know history is more than facts. It's more than dates and generals. It's about people, real people, who lived, who felt fear, who missed home, who had dreams until war swallowed them. We've all heard about World War II, Hitler, the Holocaust, the battles in France, Normandy, the fall of Berlin. But what about the Eastern Front? It was the largest, deadliest part of the war. Over 30 million people died there. Yet in the West, we rarely hear about it. Even less do we hear about what happened to the regular German soldiers who ended up there. Who were they? What did they go through? And why did so many of them never return? In this video, we go deep into that story. Not to excuse them, not to glorify them, but to understand. And by understanding, we remember. Chapter 1, Operation Barbarossa, Marching into the Unknown. On the morning of June 22nd, 1941, German troops crossed into Soviet territory. It was one of the most ambitious military plans ever attempted. Operation Barbarossa. Over 3 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, thousands of planes. Germany's goal was clear: destroy the Soviet Union quickly. Hitler believed the USSR was weak. He thought it would collapse in weeks. His generals were unsure, but followed orders. As the sun rose, planes bombed Soviet airfields. Infantry rushed across the border. Towns fell within hours. Civilians ran. Roads filled with smoke and confusion. Many German soldiers believed it would be like France, a fast campaign, a quick victory. But the land was vast. The roads were dirt. Supply lines stretched thin. Cities were far apart. Everything moved slower than expected, and the Soviets didn't give up. They burned their own villages, destroyed bridges, took food with them as they fled. The Germans called a scorched earth policy. It worked. It left them with little to eat, no shelter, and long roads ahead. The further the German army pushed, the deeper into the trap they walked. Chapter 2, The Eastern Front, a battlefield without end. Unlike the Western Front, the Eastern Front had no clear lines, no secure bases, no place to rest. It stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. Over 1,000 miles of chaos. Fighting was everywhere, in cities, in forests, along rivers, in snow-covered fields. German soldiers were often under constant attack, not just from Soviet troops, but from partisans. Partisans were local fighters, farmers, villagers, even teenagers, who used surprise attacks, sabotage, and traps. They would blow up supply trains, ambush convoys, then disappear into the woods. To fight back, the German army used brutal tactics, burning villages, shooting hostages, punishing civilians. This made the war even more personal, harsher, more vengeful, and slowly, the idea of a quick war faded. By the end of 1941, German soldiers were exhausted. Many hadn't changed clothes in months. They were living in trenches, ruined buildings, or open fields. Lice spread. Diseases followed. Letters home spoke of fear. Hunger. Cold. Still, they were ordered to keep going. Chapter 3, The Winter That Shattered the Army. Winter in Russia is not just a season. It's a weapon. Temperatures dropped so low that oil froze inside tanks. Guns jammed. Metal cracked. Breathing became painful. The German army had no winter clothing. Many soldiers were still wearing thin uniforms from summer. They wrapped themselves in rags, curtains, whatever they could find. One soldier wrote, "We stuffed newspapers into our shirts to block the wind. Our hands cracked open. Our boots froze to our feet. Frostbite became common. Men lost fingers, ears, toes. Hunger was just as deadly. The supply lines were broken. Food was stuck hundreds of miles away. Soldiers ate boiled leather, horse meat, tree bark. There are letters from soldiers who wrote goodbye messages, knowing they wouldn't survive the night. Whole units froze in place. The enemy didn't have to shoot, they just had to wait. The Soviet troops, born in the cold, had better gear, better knowledge of the land. They fought hard, pushed back, and for the first time, German troops started to retreat. Chapter 4, Stalingrad, where hope died. If there was one battle that truly changed everything for the German soldiers on the Eastern Front, it was Stalingrad. By the summer of 1942, Hitler ordered his army to push toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and take the city of Stalingrad along the way. It wasn't just about strategy anymore, it was about pride. The city had Stalin's name on it. Capturing it would be symbolic. The German Sixth Army, one of Hitler's strongest, moved in. At first, they advanced quickly. They reached the city's edge. But taking it was another matter. Stalingrad was a city of rubble, bombed into dust. Every street, every basement, every building became a battlefield. Snipers hid in factories. Soviets fought from sewers. Entire buildings changed hands 5 times in one day. German soldiers weren't fighting an army anymore. They were fighting every man, woman, and child. Winter came again. Then the Soviet counterattack. The Red Army surrounded the entire German force. Hitler ordered, "Do not retreat. Fight to the last man." Trapped with no supplies, little food, and freezing conditions, German soldiers held on for months. They ate dead horses, then dogs, then rats, then leather. Some soldiers began hallucinating. Others killed themselves. By February 1943, the German commander, General Paulus, surrendered. It was the first time a German field marshal had ever surrendered. Out of 300,000 German troops, only about 90,000 were taken prisoner. They thought they'd be home in a few months. But for most of them, that was the beginning of a new nightmare. Chapter 5, Captured by the Soviets, March into the Unknown. The German soldiers captured after Stalingrad didn't go to proper prisons. They were forced to march hundreds of miles through the Russian winter. No food, no rest, beaten if they slowed, shot if they stopped. One survivor later said, "We buried a man every mile." By the time they reached the camps, only a fraction remained alive. But the camps weren't really camps. They were labor sites, gulags. Most were in remote areas, deep forests, frozen tundra, desolate mines. German POWs were not treated as regular prisoners. They were seen as war criminals, symbols of an invasion that killed tens of millions of Soviet citizens. So they were punished. They built railroads, dug tunnels, worked in coal mines, cut timber in Siberian forests. Many were given nothing but a pickaxe and a slice of bread. Winters were long. Food was scarce. Sickness was everywhere. If you fell behind, you were beaten. If you stole food, you were shot. If you got sick, you were left to die. Thousands died every month. There are records of German soldiers working beside Japanese POWs, Soviet criminals, and political prisoners, all barely alive, all just trying to make it to the next day. Chapter 6, Forgotten by their nation, erased from memory. Back in Germany, the war was over by May 1945, but for the families of missing soldiers, there was no peace. They wrote letters, sent photographs, asked the Red Cross, asked officials, but the answers never came. In West Germany, the new government tried to negotiate for the return of prisoners, but they had little leverage. In East Germany, under Soviet control, there was silence. Talking about missing German soldiers was discouraged. Many were simply labeled as lost in the war. The soldiers became shadows. Rumors spread. Some were still alive. Some had been seen. Some had escaped, but no one could prove anything. Some families refused to believe their loved one was gone. Mothers waited by windows for years. Wives never remarried. Children grew up with a hole in their family. Germany was rebuilding economically, politically, socially. There was no room for the past. And so, the men who had disappeared into the East were slowly forgotten. Chapter 7. Long years in captivity. Time stopped. While Germany moved on, tens of thousands of German soldiers remained in Soviet captivity. Some were held for 2 years, others for 5, some for 10. A few didn't return until 1955, a full decade after the war had ended. Why so long? The Soviet Union considered these prisoners not just soldiers, but labor. Rebuilding a destroyed country required manpower. German prisoners were used to clear rubble, rebuild bridges, plant forests, dig canals. They were unpaid, unfree. They also served a political purpose. Holding prisoners showed power. It reminded Germany of its defeat. And because many of these men had no names, no identification, no records, they had no voice. When prisoners were finally released, they often returned in poor health. Some had lost all their teeth. Some were nearly blind. Many were traumatized. They had missed everything. Funerals, weddings, births, deaths. One man said, "I came home to a country I didn't recognize, and no one recognized me." Chapter 8. Homecoming. A return without a welcome. The German POWs who finally returned didn't get a hero's welcome. Some were welcomed with tears. Families ran to meet them. Children hugged fathers they'd never met. But for others, it was more complicated. Some returned to find their wives had remarried. Some returned to towns that no longer existed. Others came back to cold stares because people didn't know if they were victims or criminals. In the West, people were rebuilding their lives. Talking about the past was not encouraged. The returning soldiers often stayed silent. Many never spoke of what happened in the camps. Some couldn't. Others didn't want to relive it. They became ghosts in their own country, alive but out of place. There were no parades, no medals, just silence. Chapter 9. Still missing. The search that never ends. Even today, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers from the Eastern Front are still listed as missing. That's not a small number. Many are buried in unnamed graves across Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and other former Soviet territories. Some were dumped into pits. Others were buried by fellow soldiers during retreats. Some simply vanished. No witnesses, no reports. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, families gained access to old records. They started looking, traveling, digging. Groups formed, volunteers who searched old battlefields with metal detectors. They found bones, helmets, ID tags. Sometimes they could return these remains to families. Sometimes not. The Red Cross and German War Graves Commission continue to this day, but the Eastern Front was vast. So much was never recorded. Entire units were wiped out without a single survivor. In many cases, the land itself has changed. Forests grew over battlefields. Cities were rebuilt. The war disappeared beneath layers of time, but the loss remains. Chapter 10. Silence after war, the war that didn't end. When the Second World War officially ended in 1945, people hoped for peace, but peace didn't come easily. Germany was in ruins. Cities bombed out. Millions of civilians displaced. Food was scarce. The country was divided. And the memory of war crimes committed by the Nazis hung over everything. In that chaos, the men who never came back, those missing in the East, were quietly pushed out of national conversation. The country was trying to move forward. Fast. People wanted to rebuild their homes, their families, their lives. There was no space for complicated stories, especially not the stories of German soldiers lost in Soviet hands. For many families, grief was private. Publicly, it was awkward, even shameful, to say that your son or husband had fought for Hitler's army, even if he was just a cook or a conscripted farm boy. So they kept it to themselves. A mother might light a candle every year. A wife might keep a photograph in a drawer. A child might grow up with an empty seat at the dinner table, never knowing what really happened. The silence was heavy, but it was everywhere. Chapter 11. The survivors, living with what can't be forgotten. Some men did survive Soviet captivity. They came home, years later, thin, sick, quiet. They looked like strangers. Some had spent a decade in camps. They hadn't seen their children grow up. They had missed birthdays, funerals, the rebuilding of their country. And they didn't talk much. Not because they didn't want to, but because no one really wanted to listen. Neighbors were suspicious. Employers were distant. Family didn't understand. Some survivors had seen unspeakable things. Friends beaten to death for stealing food. Others dying of disease. Men working in snow up to their knees for 14 hours a day. And in their nightmares, it never left. PTSD wasn't a term people used back then. There were no therapy sessions or support groups for returning POWs. Most just tried to keep it inside. Some drank. Some withdrew. Some never spoke about the camps again. And then there were the questions they asked themselves. Why did I survive when others didn't? Was I part of something evil, even if I didn't believe in it? Will my own country ever see me as more than uniform? The war was over. But for them, it wasn't. Chapter 12. The Next Generation, Digging Up the Past. In the 1970s and 1980s, something began to shift. A new generation of Germans, sons and daughters of those who fought, began to ask questions. They weren't raised in war. They didn't carry guilt the way their parents did. They wanted to understand what had happened, not just the crimes of the Nazis, but the fate of the ordinary people swept into the war machine. Who was my grandfather? What happened to my uncle? Why is there no grave, no photo, no answer? And so the digging began, sometimes literally. Volunteers began organizing expeditions to former battlefields in Russia and Eastern Europe. They searched forests, fields, frozen riverbanks. They found remains, German helmets, dog tags, buttons, bones. Sometimes they could trace a soldier's identity and finally tell a family what happened. Sometimes they couldn't. But each discovery was a small piece of a giant puzzle. A lost life being acknowledged, at last. Museums, books, documentaries followed. The silence began to crack. Chapter 13. The Politics of Memory. Who deserves to be remembered? Telling the story of German soldiers who suffered in Soviet captivity is tricky because these soldiers were part of an army that invaded other countries, that followed a regime responsible for genocide, that caused unspeakable destruction across Europe. So how do we remember the individual without excusing the whole? That question has no easy answer. Some say we shouldn't tell their stories at all, that they don't deserve sympathy. Others say history isn't about judging people as heroes or villains. It's about telling the truth, even when it's messy. Because most of the men who vanished on the Eastern Front weren't ideologues. They weren't making big decisions. They were scared 19-year-olds, sons of farmers, bakers, teachers. Some believed in Nazi propaganda. Others didn't. Some just wanted to stay alive. To erase them completely is to flatten history, to ignore the human cost of war on all sides. Remembering isn't the same as excusing. Telling the story isn't the same as rewriting it. It's about understanding how war really works and how people get trapped inside it. Chapter 14, Memorials and Mass Graves, Traces in the Snow. Today, across Eastern Europe, there are quiet places where these soldiers are buried. Some are marked with simple crosses, placed by volunteers. Others are hidden, forgotten, overgrown by forests or paved over by roads. In places like Stalingrad, now called Volgograd, memorials exist for both sides. Tourists walk past trenches that once held hundreds of men. Locals still find bones when digging gardens. In Germany, a few memorials quietly mention the missing, but they're often small, tucked away, not part of the grand national story. For the families, though, even one word carved in stone, vermis missing, can mean everything. A name, a date, a place. Even if the body is never found, the recognition matters. Because these men died far from home, in a foreign land, surrounded by enemies, with no one to say their name aloud. To bring their story back into the light is to say, you were real. You were here. You mattered. So here we are, 12,000 words later. We've walked through frozen fields. We've seen men vanish into snow. We've listened to the silence of families who never got answers. We've heard the faint echoes of prisoners tapping on barak walls in far-off labor camps. And now we're left with one simple question. What do we do with this story? Because it's not just history. It's human. It's personal. And it's still alive in the quiet corners of Europe, in bones beneath the soil, in old letters locked in drawers, in dreams passed down through generations. This was never a story about numbers, not about politics, not even just about war. It's about people, about the cost of being forgotten, the men who vanished. Most of the German soldiers who went missing on the Eastern Front were not famous. They were not decision makers. They didn't command armies or design invasions. They were sons, brothers, husbands, sometimes just boys. They were farmers who had never left their village before the war, apprentices who carried wrenches more than rifles, fathers who had kissed their newborns goodbye and promised to return. They fought a war many didn't understand, for a regime many didn't believe in, against an enemy they were told to hate. Some were cruel, some were kind, some were simply trying to stay alive. They froze to death in forests, starved in trenches, died nameless in Soviet camps. And back home, the people who loved them waited, and were met with silence. No grave, no name, no last words. The silence that followed. The war ended, but the silence didn't. In Germany, the focus shifted to survival, rebuilding cities, feeding families, facing the shame of what had been done in the name of the Reich. The soldiers who didn't come home became an awkward memory. Their absence was too painful, too political, too complicated. And so the silence grew louder. Wives raised children alone. Parents set one less plate at the table. Brothers carried guilt into old age. Some survivors who did return found themselves trapped in that silence too. They couldn't talk about the camps, about the beatings, about the nightmares. They were told to move on, be grateful, rebuild. But how do you rebuild when half of you never came back? The next generation asks. Then came the next generation. The children and grandchildren of the war. They looked through old photos, found names on lists, asked the questions that had never been asked out loud. What happened to Grandpa? Why did Uncle never come back? Where's my family's missing piece? And from those questions came the search. The quiet diggers in Russia and Belarus. The volunteers uncovering bones. The archivists opening Soviet files. The historians writing what was once forbidden to say. Piece by piece, name by name, the silence began to break. And with it, the men who had been erased slowly returned, not in body, but in memory. What remembering means. Let's be clear, this is not a story to glorify. The German army committed terrible crimes during World War II. The Nazi regime built its empire on hate, violence, and lies. Millions suffered under their boots, Jews, Slavs, Poles, Soviets, and many more. But memory is not endorsement. Telling the story of a lost soldier is not the same as justifying the war he fought in. It's about recognizing that history isn't black and white. It's about admitting that war consumes everything. It turns idealists into monsters. It turns boys into killers. It turns families into gravestones. To remember the missing is not to forget the victims. It's to understand that war destroys everyone, on all sides. We still live with war. The war didn't truly end in 1945. Its shadows remain. Unmarked graves in Ukraine, unanswered questions in family trees, and trauma passed down quietly through generations. The Eastern Front lingers, in the stories untold, in the truths still avoided. That's why this video exists. That's why you're here. Because remembering isn't just about the past. It's a responsibility. What you can do, if this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Talk to your family. Ask the questions that were never asked. Dust off old letters. Learn the names. Support the work of those still searching, grave recovery groups, historians, archivists. Most of all, don't stay silent. Because silence lets people vanish twice. once in life and again in memory. When we speak, remember, and share, we push back. Their story isn't over. The men who disappeared on the Eastern Front never got to finish their story. No goodbyes, no last words, no return home. But we can carry their memory now. In names remembered, in candles lit, in truth pursued. That's how they live on. That's how history stays human. If you made it this far, thank you for caring, for listening, for not looking away. These stories deserve more than silence. Please subscribe if you want more real, human history, especially the stories that get left behind. And if your family has a story, share it in the comments. Every memory matters. Let's make sure they're not forgotten.